She was just a struggling single mom. He was just a quiet boy who barely spoke. And the dog, wounded, dying, left at their doorstep like a forgotten burden. But what happened next would change them forever. Because that German shepherd wasn't just looking for help, he was sent with a purpose. And when he left, he didn't leave them empty. He left them transformed. This isn't just a story about a rescue. It's a story about healing, legacy, and the quiet miracles God weaves through love. The storm rolled over Asheville like a wave of dark breath, crashing into the Blue Ridge Mountains with a vengeance. Rain fell in thick sheets, blurring the lights of nearby porches and washing away the last traces of autumn from the streets. Wind howled through the narrow gaps between houses like a restless spirit, shaking shutters and moaning against the windows. On the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac stood a modest single-story house painted soft blue, with flower beds long abandoned for the season. Inside, the warm glow of a fireplace cast flickering light over the worn hardwood floors, and the smell of grilled cheese and tomato soup lingered in the air. Sarah Mitchell stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing dishes with slow, methodical motions. She was 34, tall and willowy with deep auburn hair always tied in a messy low ponytail. Her eyes were a quiet blue, the color of faded denim, and they carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and said too little. She moved with the stiffness of someone constantly bracing for impact, a woman hardened by circumstance rather than temperament. Her voice, when she used it, was calm, deliberate. A natural caregiver, Sarah had once been a nurse in the ER at Mission Hospital, but a recent downsizing had left her jobless and drifting between night shifts at a local clinic and freelance caregiving gigs to keep food on the table. Her husband had left 6 years ago, and she'd never spoken of him since. At the living room coffee table, 6-year-old Evan Mitchell knelt with unmatched socks and a galaxy-themed pajama set that had seen better days. He had a mop of unruly sandy hair, a splash of freckles across his cheeks, and a curious stillness to him that unnerved other adults. He was the kind of child who didn't speak often, but always seemed to know things he shouldn't. He drew pictures of trees whispering secrets to animals and insisted he could hear thoughts in dreams. Most people wrote it off as imagination. Sarah, though skeptical, never dismissed him outright. She had learned not to ignore Evan's quiet knowing. Not after the time he'd woken her up sobbing, claiming his school teacher had dark behind her eyes, only for that same teacher to be hospitalized days later in a psychiatric crisis. The power flickered once. Then again. The house dimmed, the soft hum of the refrigerator pausing. Outside, thunder boomed like the sky itself was breaking open. Sarah dried her hands and called toward the living room. "Evan, it's getting late. You want soup now or after your bath?" No answer. She turned. Evan was no longer at the coffee table. She found him standing by the front window, his small hand pressed to the glass. His eyes were wide, not in fear, but in recognition. "Mom," he whispered. "It's here." "What's here, honey?" she asked gently, drying her hands and stepping closer. He didn't look at her. "It came to find us." A scratching sound reached her ears, soft but insistent, followed by a faint whimper. It wasn't the creak of branches or the flap of wind-blown trash. It was deliberate. Sarah's chest tightened. She motioned Evan to step back. "Stay here," she said, grabbing her phone and walking slowly toward the door. The storm gusted as she cracked it open, and the scent of wet leaves and ozone flooded in. Lightning flashed, and for a brief moment, the shape on her porch was illuminated, massive, soaked, and crumpled. A German shepherd lay slumped against the doorframe, its fur slick with rain and matted with mud. One of its sides was dark with blood, and it barely lifted its head at her presence. Amber eyes met hers, clouded by exhaustion, but unmistakably conscious. It whimpered once, a sound that pierced through her guarded heart like a splinter. "Mom," Evan whispered from behind her. "It's Shadow. He came for us." "Sweetheart, we don't know this dog. He could be dangerous," Sarah said, though even as she spoke, she knew she wasn't convincing herself. She looked back at the dog, who made no attempt to move or growl. He simply stared, pleading, not threatening. The wound on his side was deep and raw, crusted with rain-thinned blood. His body trembled, not with fear, but with cold and effort. His breathing was shallow, barely lifting his ribcage. Sarah hesitated. Every instinct from her medical training screamed at her. This animal needed help now, or he wouldn't make it till morning. But so did the mother in her. Raising a young child alone meant weighing every unknown for danger. Yet as she looked into the eyes of the broken creature on her doorstep, she saw not menace, but a quiet dignity and desperation. She turned to Evan. Go get the blue blanket from the couch. And a bowl of water. Evan nodded, not surprised. Not even elated. As if he had always known this moment would come. Sarah grabbed a clean towel from the laundry basket and cautiously approached the animal. Easy, she murmured as she knelt beside him. I'm not here to hurt you. The dog made a low, weary sound, almost a sigh, as she pressed the towel gently against the wound to stem the bleeding. He didn't flinch. His trust was absolute, undeserved, and instant. Evan returned with the blanket and the water. Sarah folded the towel beneath the dog's body, then carefully wrapped the blanket around him. His tail thumped once against the porch. Just once. But it was enough. Shadow, Evan said softly, placing the water bowl down. You're safe now. Sarah looked up. Why do you call him that? Evan shrugged. Because that's his name. They carried the dog inside together. He was lighter than he looked, his body hollowed by hunger and pain. Sarah laid him on the soft rug near the fire, checking his paws for debris and brushing away the worst of the mud. The dog's breathing remained labored but steadier. For the first time in weeks, the house felt full, not just of noise but of presence. A weight lifted she hadn't known she was carrying. Outside, the storm raged. But inside, under flickering firelight, a boy watched over a dog who should have been dead, and a woman who had nearly given up rediscovered something close to hope. Sarah sat back and whispered to herself more than to Evan. Why here? Why now? Evan, eyes never leaving the dog, answered softly. Because we're the ones. The morning after the storm arrived reluctantly, with light filtered through the haze of cloud cover and tree limbs dripping from the long night's downpour. Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway of her small kitchen, cradling a mug of black coffee between both hands, her eyes fixed on the shape lying curled by the fireplace. The German shepherd Shadow, if Evan was to be believed, had not moved much during the night, save the subtle rise and fall of his ribcage and an occasional twitch of his paws, as if chasing something in his dreams. His fur, now partially dry, was a mix of dark sable and black, the kind of coat that must have once shimmered in sunlight, but now clung in clumps from rain and dried blood. His wound had crusted slightly from the pressure Sarah applied the night before, but it was clear the infection was lurking. She made a mental note to try calling a vet clinic once they opened. She turned at the soft sound of footsteps. Evan shuffled into the room in the same space-themed pajamas from last night, his hair sticking up at odd angles. He looked as though he'd slept lightly, but his eyes were clear. He walked past her and sat cross-legged near the dog, resting his small hand on the thick fur behind Shadow's ears. The dog responded with the faintest thump of his tail. He's still tired, Evan said softly. Sarah crouched beside him, brushing a hand through his messy hair. We'll get him help soon. I'll call someone this morning. Evan didn't reply right away. Instead, he leaned in toward Shadow and whispered something Sarah couldn't quite hear. Then, as casually as if reporting the weather, he added, His name really is Shadow. He told me. Sarah blinked. He told you? Evan nodded, still petting. In my dream. He said his name is Shadow, and he used to live with the sad man in the woods. Sarah stared at him. The sad man? He's gone now. Shadow said he waited, but no one came. So he came here instead. Sarah frowned, her mind flickering back through memory. When she first moved to Asheville 3 years ago, she used to run early in the mornings before her shifts. There was a small dirt trail off Sycamore Hollow Road that led into the trees and ended near an old white cabin. Every time she passed it, she'd see a figure, an older man always alone, sitting on the porch. He never waved, never smiled, just stared straight ahead. His presence had always struck her, not as eerie but deeply sad. She had stopped jogging that trail months ago after her shifts changed, but the image came back to her now with unusual clarity. She looked at Evan. You mean the cabin off Sycamore? Evan nodded again. That's where he was. A shiver ran through her that wasn't from the cool morning air. And how do you know that? Evan glanced at her as if the answer was obvious. Because I saw it. Shadow showed me. Sarah stood up, brushing her hands on her jeans. She was used to Evan's odd sensitivities. He had always seemed to move just a little off the rhythm of other children. She'd fought with more than one school administrator who claimed he was disengaged or too quiet. But this felt different. Sharper. More specific. She didn't press him further. Instead, she picked up her phone and began calling local vets. It wasn't until the 4th number, Redwood Veterinary Clinic, that someone picked up. The voice on the other end was bright and professional. Redwood Vet, Dr. Wynn speaking. Sarah explained the situation briefly. Found injured dog, deep wound, no signs of aggression, urgent but stable. I'm booked solid today, the woman replied, then paused, as if reconsidering. But if you can bring him in by 9, I can squeeze him in before surgery. Thank you, Sarah said, relief warming her voice. You said German Shepherd? Any collar? Sarah looked down at the floor beside the blanket where the dog lay. She hadn't noticed a collar last night, but now that he had dried slightly, she spotted a worn leather strap mostly hidden beneath his thick neck fur. She knelt beside him, gently nudging the tag forward. The letters were nearly worn away, but one name was still visible, Shadow. Her heart stopped for a beat. Evan hadn't seen this. She was sure of it. Yes, she said into the phone, her voice low. His name's Shadow. Well, Dr. Wynne said lightly, he's already ahead of most of my patients. They arranged to arrive within the hour. As Sarah ended the call, she knelt beside Evan again. We'll take him to someone who can help him now, okay? Evan looked up, face unreadable. They have to be kind. He's scared of cold places. Sarah gave a small laugh despite herself. We'll make sure of that. By 8:45, Shadow was resting on the back seat of Sarah's station wagon, cushioned by layers of towels and a thick comforter. The drive to Redwood Veterinary took them through the winding edges of Asheville's forest-lined roads, where bare trees dripped water and squirrels darted across wet asphalt. Redwood was a small standalone clinic with a red roof and a wooden porch. A bell chimed as they entered, and a tall woman in scrubs looked up from behind the counter. She was in her early 40s, with chestnut hair tied back in a low braid and sharp green eyes framed by glasses. Her name tag read Dr. April Wynne. You must be the Mitchells, she said, stepping forward and crouching beside Shadow without hesitation. He let us carry him in, Sarah said. Didn't even whimper. That tells me more than a scan ever could, Dr. Wynne said, her tone warm but focused. Let's take a look. She guided them into an exam room. Evan stayed close to Shadow's side, holding his paw gently. Dr. Wynne examined the wound, cleaned it, and injected a mild sedative to ease the pain. This wasn't an animal attack, she murmured, mostly to herself. The cut's too clean. Straight edge. Could be a blade. Sarah's stomach turned. You mean someone hurt him? Possibly, April said, eyes narrowing. But the strange thing is how far he got after that. He must have traveled for miles on that leg. From the woods, Evan said. April turned to him, surprised. You've got a good guess. It's not a guess, Evan replied calmly. He came from the white cabin. April froze. She straightened slowly and looked at Sarah. Wait, you mean the old Reed property? You know it? Sarah asked. April nodded, her expression shifting. I treated a dog there once. Few years ago. The owner was Thomas Reed. Vietnam vet. Lived alone. Had a shepherd. Do you remember the dog's name? April hesitated. Shadow. Shadow lay stretched on an old quilt in the corner of the living room, his body still and eyes half-lidded in that peculiar state between sleep and awareness. It had been 2 days since the visit to Redwood Veterinary Clinic. Dr. April Wynne had stitched the gash on his side with precise care and prescribed a round of antibiotics that Sarah administered carefully each morning and evening. The wound no longer bled, but his movements were slow and cautious, and he flinched slightly when touched near the injury, as if the pain lingered deeper than flesh. His appetite, however, had returned with steady progression. He had eaten an entire bowl of rice and chicken earlier that morning, and had gently lapped at Evan's hand afterward, his tail giving a grateful twitch. Sarah stood in the kitchen, folding a pile of laundry she hadn't touched in a week. Her narrow shoulders were stiff from nights spent half sleeping on the couch next to Shadow, and the dark hollows beneath her blue eyes had deepened. Still, there was something lighter in her movements now, as if the house itself had exhaled. She paused when she heard the light pitter of footsteps on wood. Evan entered, holding a sketch pad under one arm and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He wore his favorite gray sweatshirt, the one with faded stars across the chest, and his expression was thoughtful, lips slightly parted. I drew it, he said. Sarah raised an eyebrow, setting the laundry aside. Drew what, sweetheart? The place he used to live. I saw it again. He flipped the sketch pad open and held it up. Sarah stepped closer. The drawing was rough but unmistakable, a white cabin tucked under tall trees, a rusted mailbox out front, and a front porch with a rocking chair, and what appeared to be a man sitting with a dog at his feet. She blinked. Evan, when did you dream this? Last night, he said. It wasn't like other dreams. It was like being there. She placed a hand on his shoulder and knelt beside him. You saw that man again? He nodded. He had the same coat. brown with the elbows worn out. He looked sad but not mean. And Shadow was there. Only he was younger. Before Sarah could respond, a knock came at the front door. Shadow's ears perked sharply, and he rose to his feet for the first time that morning, moving with visible stiffness but alertness in his eyes. He let out a low huff and stood protectively near Evan. Sarah stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. Through the front window, she saw a police vehicle parked just outside. She opened the door to find a tall man in a beige sheriff's jacket, with thinning salt and pepper hair and a square jaw. His name tag read Sheriff Cole. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Sarah Mitchell?" She nodded. "That's right. I'm Sheriff Cole. Sorry to drop by unannounced, but there's been a string of attempted break-ins in this neighborhood. Last night, someone reported suspicious movement near the back of the Hawthorne residence just down the road." Sarah leaned against the doorframe, suddenly uneasy. "Was anything taken?" "Not that we know of," Cole replied, "but there were muddy footprints near their shed. We're going door to door to check if anyone saw or heard anything." She hesitated, then glanced over her shoulder. "Well, no. But 2 nights ago, our dog showed up. Hurt bad. My son says he was running from something." The sheriff's gaze followed hers to Shadow, who now stood rigid behind her, watching Cole with measured suspicion. "That the dog in question?" Cole asked. Sarah stepped aside. "We've been treating him since. The vet says the injury could have been caused by a blade." Cole's brow furrowed. "That's not a small animal. If someone's out there attacking dogs, especially shepherds, that's not something we can take lightly. You mind if I take a look?" Sarah opened the door further, allowing him inside. Cole knelt near Shadow but didn't reach out, his eyes thoughtful. "German shepherd, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Definitely trained. Doesn't flinch unless he senses intent." He rose. "Who's the previous owner?" "Thomas Reed," Sarah said quietly. "The vet recognized Shadow from years ago. Said Mr. Reed lived up near the woods." Cole's expression shifted. "I knew Thomas. Retired military. Kept to himself, but he wasn't unfriendly. Passed away this past spring, if I remember right. Heart attack. He used to watch me when I jogged by," Sarah murmured. Never spoke, just nodded. Cole folded his arms. "We found that property vandalized a few months ago. Looked like someone had tried to break in. No one thought much of it since the place was empty. But if the dog ran from that direction, and he's been hurt, might be connected." Evan, who had stood quietly nearby, spoke up. He was hiding something. Cole looked at him. "Who was son?" "Mr. Reed. But not bad stuff. Important stuff." Shadow was guarding it. Cole studied the boy, clearly unsure how to respond. "Well, if that's true, someone might have wanted it bad enough to come looking. Thanks for letting me know." He stepped back toward the door. "Keep him close. If anything else strange happens, call me right away." Sarah walked him out and watched as the cruiser drove away. She felt a strange tightness in her chest, not fear exactly, but the sense that some hidden thread was being slowly pulled from beneath the floorboards of her life. Later that afternoon, her phone rang. It was Dr. Wynne. "Hey, just checking in on our patient," April said. "He's doing better," Sarah replied. "Walking, eating. More alert." "I've been digging through old clinic records," April said. "Back when I treated Shadow, I made a note. Thomas Reed specifically requested I never sedate the dog unless absolutely necessary. He said Shadow had special training. Military adjacent." Sarah frowned. "What kind of training?" "Behavioral alerts. PTSD response. Guard duty, document scent detection. Not just a comfort dog, something more." Sarah looked over to where Shadow now sat by the window, watching the trees with still intensity. "That would explain the way he understands things. He listens. And he reacts to certain people?" April asked. "Yes," Sarah replied. "Like he's judging them." April paused. "Sarah, I don't think this dog ended up at your door by accident." The morning sun slipped through half-closed blinds, casting narrow bands of gold across the floor where Shadow lay curled in his now customary spot by the window. His ears twitched every so often, responding to distant sounds only he seemed to hear, and his eyes, though tired, held the sharp gleam of vigilance. The wound on his side, once raw and angry, had begun to close with the help of antibiotics, and Sarah could see he moved more fluidly now, less burdened by pain, though the way he limped reminded her he wasn't healing from just flesh and bone. Sarah stood at the kitchen counter, stirring honey into a mug of chamomile tea. She had switched from coffee recently, trying to calm the wired, unsettled energy that had followed her since Shadow's arrival. Her face, once pale and hollowed by fatigue, now showed more color, though the lines at the corners of her eyes remained. She wore a navy blue cardigan over a fitted white t-shirt, jeans frayed at the knees, and her hair, loosely braided, hung over one shoulder. She was still figuring out what it meant to slow down, to be present, to carry less fear, but the dog sleeping on her rug had altered something in her quietly. Evan sat cross-legged at the dining table with a bowl of cereal and a small stack of colored pencils. He had drawn 2 more pictures before breakfast. One was of Shadow standing beside a man in a long brown coat. The other was of a locked wooden box surrounded by trees. He hadn't said much while he drew, but he had been humming, a low tune that Sarah realized was the same one her grandmother used to sing when she was sick. It was the first time she'd heard Evan hum anything since his father left. The house phone rang, its sound crisp and abrupt. Sarah wiped her hands on a towel and answered. "Hello? Sarah, it's April Wynne," came the familiar voice. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "No, it's fine," Sarah replied, glancing at the clock. "We've been up." "Everything okay?" "I was going through my files last night," April said, "and I found something you might want to see, an old intake form from when I first met Thomas Reed and Shadow. There's a note I think you'll find interesting." Sarah leaned against the counter. "What kind of note?" "Not over the phone," April said. "I'd rather show you. Can you come by the clinic today? Late afternoon." "We'll be there," Sarah said. When she hung up, Evan looked up from his drawing. "It's about Shadow's old job, right?" Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral. "It might be." "Why do you say that?" "Because the box is important," he said, tapping the second drawing. "And Shadow can't tell you unless we find the key." Sarah hesitated. "What kind of box?" "The one Mr. Reed buried near the tall tree with the crooked trunk." "The one that leans a little left," Evan said, his voice matter of fact. "And how do you know that?" He shrugged. "Shadow showed me in my sleep. And Mr. Reed said it holds the thing he promised to keep safe." Later that afternoon, the wind carried the smell of dry leaves and chimney smoke as Sarah parked outside Redwood Clinic. The waiting area was empty, and April greeted them immediately, ushering them into her office. Her expression was thoughtful, her scrubs wrinkled around the knees from a long shift. Dr. April Wynne was a woman in her 40s with clear, pale skin that blushed easily, hair the color of burnt copper pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and a look of practical intelligence that rarely softened unless she was with animals. She closed the office door and handed Sarah a photocopy from an old intake form dated 6 years ago. "This is from the day Thomas brought Shadow in for his first checkup. Look at the section he filled in under notes." Sarah read aloud. "Trained under Project Vigil. Handler has requested emergency protocol if subject is relocated unexpectedly." April tapped the margin. "That phrase, Project Vigil," I asked around. "It wasn't a common training program. It was for retired military personnel entrusted with non-digital storage of confidential material." "You mean Shadow was trained to guard something? Or to remember where something was," April said. "These dogs were taught scent-based recall, visual sight identification, even complex object recognition. They weren't just companions, they were guardians." Sarah looked at Evan, who sat quietly in a chair beside her, his feet swinging. He hadn't said a word since they entered, but now he leaned forward. "It was the box," he said. April looked at him gently. "What box, sweetheart?" Evan folded his hands in his lap. "Mr. Reed called it his last promise. He said Shadow had to give it to someone good." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "He said that to you?" Evan nodded. "In the dream. He said he couldn't hold on to it anymore." April blinked, clearly unsure whether to indulge or question, then chose to believe. "There might be more. Thomas kept journals, or at least he hinted he did. If Shadow really did lead you here for a reason," Sarah inhaled slowly. "We need to go back to the house. The cabin. That property's not legally owned by anyone yet," April said. "The estate's still caught up in court. But if you're just walking near it—" "I don't care," Sarah said quietly. "If there's something there, we'll find it." That night, after Evan went to bed, Sarah sat on the porch with a glass of water and Shadow curled at her feet. The wind had picked up again, and the rustling trees reminded her of stories half told. She looked down at Shadow. "What were you trying to protect?" she murmured. "And why us?" Shadow looked up at her, not blinking, his gaze deep and still. In that moment, Sarah felt something unspoken pass between them, something ancient, something heavy. Not a warning. A burden. The night had settled thick over Asheville like a woolen blanket, muffling even the usual rustle of the trees outside the Mitchell home. The late November chill had crept under the eaves and pressed against the windows with foggy persistence. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. Sarah lay in bed, her body exhausted but her mind ticking restlessly. She had tried chamomile again, tried reading, even meditating with one of those guided apps on her phone, but nothing dulled the growing sense of unease that had taken root since their visit to the clinic. Down the hall, Evan's door stood slightly ajar, casting a soft triangle of yellow light from his night lamp. He had insisted Shadow sleep in his room, something Sarah had hesitated about at first. But the dog had curled beside the boy's bed with such instinctive protectiveness that her objections melted before they left her lips. There was something sacred about their bond, something that made even Sarah, who didn't easily believe in signs or spirits, pause. It was just past 2 a.m. when Sarah jolted awake. No loud bang, no alarm, only a shift in the air. A mother's instinct. She sat upright, blinking into the darkness. The house was still. Then came the whisper. "Mom." She turned toward the doorway where Evan stood barefoot, his space-themed pajamas wrinkled and his hair tousled from sleep. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even crying. He just looked certain. "Someone's outside," he said calmly. Sarah's stomach dropped. "Did you hear something?" "No," Evan said, shaking his head. "Shadow did. And I saw it. In the dream." Sarah moved fast. She slipped out of bed, pulled on a sweater over her tank top, and followed Evan down the hall. In his room, Shadow stood rigid, hackles raised, ears erect and eyes locked on the back window. He growled, a low, restrained vibration that rumbled deep in his chest. She crept to the window and pulled back the curtain slightly. For a moment, there was only the dark outline of the trees, branches skeletal in the moonlight. Then near the far fence, something shifted just enough. A shadow within shadows. She froze. Without hesitation, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was low but firm as she gave their address, described the movement, and requested a patrol. "Officers are en route," the dispatcher said. "Stay inside. Lock all doors." Sarah hung up and locked the back door again, though it had been secured before bed. Evan hadn't moved. He remained close to Shadow, his hand gently gripping the dog's thick fur. "Why would someone come now?" Sarah murmured aloud, more to herself. "Because they're looking for it," Evan said softly. She turned to him. "Looking for what?" "The thing Mr. Reed was hiding," he answered. "But they don't know where it is. That's why Shadow came to us." 15 minutes later, red and blue lights flared across the front lawn, and 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser. One of them was Sheriff Cole, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. "Ma'am," he said as she let him in, "you did the right thing calling. We found fresh tracks behind your house. Muddy prints leading from the woods to the back fence, and then toward your kitchen window." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. "Did they try to get in?" "Not yet," Cole replied, his jaw tight. "But they were watching. That much is clear." The second officer was younger, early 30s maybe, with sandy blonde hair and a cautious expression. His name tag read Deputy Lorne. He held a flashlight and a small evidence bag with a partial glove print on it. "We'll dust it and check for matches," he said. "But odds are this person's done this before." As Cole walked the perimeter one last time, Sarah stood with Lorne in the living room. Evan sat silently on the couch, stroking Shadow's head. The dog had settled, but his eyes remained vigilant, his head rising whenever a sound flickered beyond the windows. "Your dog's trained," Lorne remarked. "He wasn't ours," Sarah replied. "He just showed up. Injured." The vet traced him back to a veteran named Thomas Reed. Lorne gave a slow nod. "I know that name. He served under my uncle. Quiet guy. Decorated. Lived in that cabin near Briarwood Trail, right?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Shadow used to be his. Now, I don't know. It's like he's still following orders." Cole stepped back inside, brushing rain from his jacket. "I'll have patrols swing by every night this week. Keep your lights on outside. If you notice anything at all, call." Sarah nodded, grateful and unsettled. As the officers left, she turned to Shadow, who had risen again and stood watching the window, his body taut, his ears flicking toward the tree line. Sarah followed his gaze. Always the same direction. Always toward the woods. The next morning brought a brittle wind and skies the color of smoke. The air felt heavy with something unsaid, a silence that clung to the Mitchell home like dust to forgotten windows. Sarah sat on the porch steps in a faded green hoodie and jeans, her hair tied up in a careless knot. The sleeves of her hoodie were tugged over her hands, and she watched the street without really seeing it. Her mind replayed the events of the night before, the shadow in the yard, the muddy footprints, Sheriff Cole's grim warning. She hadn't slept more than an hour. Inside, Evan sat beside Shadow, gently brushing the dog's thick coat with the small, soft-bristled brush they'd picked up from the clinic. Shadow's eyes closed under the attention, but his body remained alert. Every so often, he'd raise his head and look toward the woods as though expecting someone to emerge. "Mom," Evan said from the doorway, holding the brush in one hand. "Shadow wants to go." Sarah turned. "Go where?" Evan stepped barefoot onto the porch, his face solemn. "Back to Mr. Reed's house." She hesitated. They had spoken about it in whispers, about how maybe there was something left behind, something that Shadow remembered. But part of her had hoped to delay it, to wait for a more logical reason. "He's showing me again," Evan added. "In the dreams." Sarah studied her son. Evan had always had a stillness to him, a knowing beyond his years. She had spent most of his early childhood afraid people would label him as odd. But the past few weeks had shifted her fear. She was starting to believe him. "All right," she said finally, her voice low. "Let's go." By mid-afternoon, they were driving up the winding road toward Briarwood Trail. The woods were thinning for the winter, and skeletal branches clawed at the sky above. Sarah gripped the wheel tightly, her jaw set, her eyes flicking toward the rearview mirror every few seconds. Shadow sat in the back seat, quiet but alert, his head slightly lowered between the windows, eyes watching the tree-line pass like an old memory. The cabin appeared slowly behind the thick brush, a one-story wooden structure with paint peeling from the siding and a sagging porch. The place had been left untouched since Thomas Reed's death. A tattered flag still hung limply from the porch beam. Sarah parked the car just off the gravel path and stepped out. The wind stirred the leaves at her feet. Evan climbed out silently, Shadow following close behind. The dog's steps were cautious but purposeful, each paw placed with instinctive precision. He paused near the edge of the porch, sniffed the air, and growled, a low, almost inaudible warning. Sarah froze. "What is it?" Before Evan could speak, they heard it, a floorboard creaking from inside the cabin. Not from settling wood or wind, but from the weight of someone moving. Shadow stiffened. Sarah reached for Evan's hand. "Stay close." They crept up the steps, Sarah's heart thudding hard enough she could hear it in her ears. She tried the door. It opened with a slow groan. The inside of the cabin smelled of mildew, dust, and something else, sweat, recent and real. From the dim hallway ahead, a figure appeared. A man in his early 30s, tall, wiry, with slick-back dark hair and a leather jacket scuffed at the sleeves. His expression was one of instant calculation, the eyes of someone caught but unwilling to run. "You shouldn't be here," he said coolly. Sarah stepped protectively in front of Evan. "Neither should you." The man gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Family has rights." Evan stared at him. "You're Logan." Sarah flinched. "How do you know that?" Evan kept his eyes on the stranger. "Shadow remembers." The man, Logan Reed, tilted his head. "Smart kid." Logan was Thomas Reed's estranged nephew. Sarah had heard the name once from April, mentioned in passing. Supposedly Logan had been removed from Thomas's will after years of strained communication, debts, and broken promises. "What are you looking for?" Sarah demanded. Logan didn't answer immediately. He walked to the dusty mantel where a clock had once sat and traced a finger across the wood. "My uncle was a paranoid man, always talking about legacies and promises. Said there were things too valuable to be left to the government. He trusted that damn dog more than any human." His gaze landed on Shadow, who stood with hackles half-raised, growling low. "I'm just trying to find what he left behind," Logan said. "It belongs to me. Blood means something." "You were cut out of the will," Sarah replied. "He made a mistake." Logan stepped closer, and Shadow lunged, not to bite but to block. He placed himself between Sarah and Logan, head lowered, ready. Logan stopped. "Still loyal after all this time. Impressive." Evan spoke up. "You'll never find the box. You don't even know where to look." Logan narrowed his eyes. "And you do." Evan said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Sarah reached for Evan's shoulder. "We should go." Logan raised both hands mockingly. "Be my guest. But whatever's here, it's not safe with you." They left without another word. As Sarah closed the door behind her, she felt Shadow press against her leg, steady and strong. The dog's body trembled slightly, not in fear but fury barely contained. Once they reached the car, she turned to Evan. "He's going to keep searching." "I know," Evan said. "But he won't find it." "Because of the dreams?" "No," Evan said. because Shadow only shows it to people he trusts. That night, Sarah watched Shadow lie beside Evan's bed, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, facing the window as always. His gaze was fixed on the darkness outside, but his presence radiated something deeper, a promise held, a warning issued. The sky above Asheville had turned a slate gray, bruised with impending rain. The bare branches of November trees clattered like dry bones in the wind as Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, her hands deep in dishwater, her mind elsewhere. Every window in the house was locked, every curtain drawn. But the memory of Logan Reed's face in the cabin, his thin smile, the cold entitlement in his eyes, it had followed her home like a shadow of its own. Inside, Evan sat cross-legged on the living room floor, drawing with charcoal on thick, yellowed paper he'd pulled from an old art book. The drawing wasn't of Shadow this time. It was a house, Thomas's cabin, but viewed from above like a map. And in the center, a black shape, like a box half buried beneath floorboards. Shadow lay beside Evan, alert as always, his dark coat glinting slightly in the light from the lamp. Though visibly calm, there was a coiled energy to him, his ears flicking at every creak, his tail twitching whenever the wind howled outside. He had not left Evan's side since they returned from the cabin. Sarah dried her hands and walked into the living room. "He's not coming back," she said, mostly to herself. "He wouldn't be that reckless." Evan didn't look up. "He's already here." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Shadow rose with a sudden snarl, a full-bodied growl that vibrated through the floor. His ears were forward, nose pointed toward the hallway. Sarah's heart pounded. She moved toward the stairs just as a sharp bang came from upstairs, a door, not opened, but slammed. She grabbed Evan and pulled him behind her. "Go to the basement. Don't come out until I say." "But, now." Evan obeyed without another word, Shadow bolting up the stairs in a blur of muscle and fur. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice tight with panic as she reported a break-in. As the operator assured her that units were on the way, a crash echoed from upstairs. Something wooden splintered. Then a man's voice, low and frantic. "Where is it?" Sarah crept up the stairs, phone still in hand. She moved past the bathroom and Evan's room, reaching the doorway of the master bedroom. The door was open. Logan stood inside, drawers torn from the dresser, papers strewn across the floor, a crowbar in one hand. "Get out!" Sarah shouted. Logan turned, startled, just as Shadow lunged. The dog launched himself with terrifying speed, jaws clamping onto Logan's forearm as the man shrieked and fell backward, slamming into the closet door. The crowbar clanged to the ground. Shadow held on, growling deep in his chest, not releasing even as Logan thrashed wildly. "Call him off!" Logan yelled. "Get him off me!" Sarah didn't move. Her voice, when she spoke, was deadly quiet. "You broke into a child's home. You threatened my son." A moment later, red and blue lights flickered through the upstairs window, followed by pounding footsteps on the porch. Officers burst through the front door, and Sarah called down, "Upstairs! Now!" Within moments, 2 officers, Sheriff Cole and Deputy Lorne, rushed into the bedroom, weapons drawn but lowered once they saw the scene. Cole's expression turned stony. "Shadow off," Sarah commanded firmly. Shadow obeyed instantly, stepping back but keeping his body between Logan and Evan's bedroom. Cole and Lorne restrained Logan quickly, securing him in cuffs. His arm bled through his jacket, but he didn't speak. He just glared at Sarah as if she had stolen something that was his by right. As the officers led Logan out, Lorne paused by the doorway. What was he looking for? Sarah shook her head. Something he thought was his uncle's. Later that evening, after the police had left and calm had begun to settle over the house like dust after a storm, Evan emerged from the basement, wide-eyed but composed. Shadow greeted him with a gentle nudge to the chest, then returned to pacing. Sarah gathered the wreckage in the bedroom, drawers scattered and floorboards scratched. As she bent to lift a fallen photo frame, she noticed something strange, a loose board beneath the dresser, slightly ajar. She dropped to her knees and tugged at it. It gave way with a creak, revealing a small hollow space beneath the floor. Inside was a box, wooden, weather-worn, with a brass latch tarnished green with age. Evan knelt beside her. "That's it." Sarah opened it slowly. Inside were several sealed envelopes, marked with government insignias. Alongside them was a thick, handwritten letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. It began, "My name is Thomas Reed. I served my country for 20 years in places the world will never know existed. When I retired, I was asked to keep certain documents hidden, things not meant for digital trails, only for minds that still remember the value of secrecy. Shadow was trained to guard them. But no soldier lives forever, and no dog should carry a burden alone. Sarah swallowed hard. The person who finds this should be one of kindness and clarity, the letter continued. Someone with a heart unclouded by ambition. Shadow will know. Trust the dog. He speaks not with words, but with choices. And if he chose you, it is because he saw what I once hoped for in men. At the bottom of the letter, a smaller line was written in fainter ink. He is more than a guardian. He is my last message. Sarah folded the letter back carefully and looked at Shadow, now curled next to Evan. You found us, she whispered. The morning light in Asheville carried a gentleness rarely seen in November. It filtered through sheer kitchen curtains and golden beams, resting on the warm wood floor like memories left to dry. Outside, frost kissed the edges of the yard, and tiny birds flitted between leafless branches, chirping like secrets only they understood. Inside the Mitchell home, there was something else in the air, a quiet, unfamiliar calm. Shadow lay sprawled near the fireplace, his body curled in a loose crescent, breathing slow and steady. His coat gleamed from the brushing Evan had insisted on that morning, each strand a shade between burnt mahogany and black. The scars along his side, once raw and angry, had begun to fade beneath healthy fur. He was still lean, still alert, but no longer haunted. Evan sat cross-legged beside him, humming under his breath as he lined up a row of crayons. The boy had changed. Even Sarah noticed it. Evan, once hesitant to speak around strangers and prone to silence, even at home, now talked almost freely. His voice was soft but confident, as though the presence of Shadow gave him permission to be heard. When he spoke to the dog, it was more than conversation, it was communion. You don't like red, do you? Evan asked, glancing at Shadow as he pushed the red crayon to the side. It makes you sad. Shadow's ear twitched. His gaze shifted to Evan's hand, then back to his face. Evan nodded like he understood, and picked up a green crayon instead. Sarah, meanwhile, stood by the hallway mirror, adjusting her dark blue scrubs. The embroidered paw print above her heart read Blue Ridge Animal Clinic. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and the circles beneath her eyes were lighter now, not gone, but fading. At 37, Sarah had the kind of weary grace earned from survival. Tall and lean, with pale skin and thoughtful eyes, she carried herself like someone who had walked through storms and come out on the other side not untouched, but unbroken. Her new job at the clinic had been unexpected. April had offered it after one long conversation over coffee and a shared love of animals. It wasn't the hospital work Sarah had trained for, but it offered something rarer: flexibility, empathy, a slower pace. After years in sterile hallways and dealing with bureaucratic exhaustion, the scent of animals and antiseptic now felt like home. She called to Evan, I'll be back by 6. April's letting me Shadow on intake today. Can Shadow come with us? Evan asked. Sarah smiled. Not this time, but I bet he'll be waiting right by the door when you get home. Evan nodded, satisfied. Shadow raised his head and padded over to Sarah, brushing against her legs gently. She bent to rub his ears, her fingers curling into his thick fur. Your family now, she whispered. The clinic was nestled near the foot of the Blue Ridge Parkway, surrounded by open fields and a small grove of maple trees now bare from the season. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and bustling. Dr. April Kendall, in her mid-40s, had short auburn hair, crow's feet at the corners of her eyes, and a voice like someone who smiled even when she was tired. She had worked in veterinary medicine for nearly 2 decades and carried the kind of calm confidence Sarah admired. You'll start by checking vitals, April explained as they entered the intake room. If you're comfortable, we can move to simple wound care by next week. Sarah nodded, watching as April lifted a golden retriever onto the table with practiced ease. She wasn't nervous. Her hospital training kicked in instinctively, and as the afternoon wore on, her muscles remembered the rhythm of care, the gentle touch, the subtle observation, the empathy spoken without words. Back at home, Evan spent the day drawing beside Shadow, then helping Mrs. Henley next door rake the last leaves from her yard. Mrs. Henley, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s, wore a lavender shawl and smelled of cinnamon. She had always been kind to Evan, and now she greeted Shadow with warm curiosity. Well, aren't you just noble looking, she said, offering him a treat from her apron pocket. Shadow sniffed it carefully, then accepted it with a gentle mouth. You two belong together, she told Evan as he gathered the last of the red leaves into a bag. He watches you like an older brother. Evan beamed. He hears me. Mrs. Henley blinked. Oh, he doesn't talk like people. But I understand him anyway. The older woman smiled gently, patting Evan's shoulder. Some bonds don't need words, dear. As evening fell, Sarah returned, tired but fulfilled. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and kicked off her shoes, the familiar weight of home settling over her. Evan greeted her with a drawing, a sketch of their house with Shadow in front, sitting straight and tall beneath a sky filled with stars. It's us, he said. And he's staying forever. Sarah's throat tightened, but she nodded. Forever sounds good. Later that night, as frost gathered again along the windows and the fireplace flickered in amber waves, Sarah read the final lines of Thomas Reed's letter again. A family not made of perfection, but of worth. A child who hears, a woman who remembers, a dog who still believes. That will be enough. She folded the letter and placed it in the box beneath her bed, right next to Evan's drawing. Above, the stars wheeled silently across the sky, and in the soft hush of the house, Shadow rose once more to his post by Evan's door. He would guard this peace, however brief. The first snow of December arrived softly, like a hush falling over the world. Flakes danced in the gray morning light, brushing rooftops and resting gently on the brittle grass. The Mitchell home sat still in the hush, smoke curling from its chimney, warmth alive inside, but something had shifted in the quiet rhythm that had settled over the house. Shadow had stopped eating. At first, Sarah thought it might be a stomach bug or something he picked up while walking through the fields behind the clinic. But by the second day, the signs were undeniable. He moved more slowly, struggled to climb the steps, and his once keen eyes were clouded with fatigue. Evan noticed too. The boy had grown more perceptive since Shadow entered his life, as though the bond between them sharpened his instincts. He didn't ask questions. He simply stayed close to the dog, resting his small hand on Shadow's side whenever they were together, whispering to him as if telling stories only they could hear. Dr. April Kendall arrived the third morning after Sarah's quiet call. The vet stepped through the back door bundled in a forest green coat, her face solemn beneath the rim of a knitted hat. April was a woman built for cold weather and tough conversations, her square jaw set with quiet strength. Her gentle nature rarely broke, but today there was a tightness at the corners of her eyes. Shadow lay near the hearth, his body curled but his breath labored. April knelt beside him, brushing her gloved hand along his fur. "Hey, old soul," she murmured, pressing her stethoscope to his chest. She listened for a long time, frowning as she shifted angles, her silence growing heavier. Sarah stood behind her, arms folded, trying to brace herself. "Is it his heart?" April didn't look up. "Yes. He's in the late stages of heart failure. It's common in dogs who've served, especially ones pushed past the limits for years. I saw similar cases when I worked near the base." Sarah closed her eyes. "Is there anything we can do?" "We can ease the discomfort," April said gently. "But he's tired, and I think he knows." Evan stood nearby, silent. He didn't cry. He simply walked over, sat down beside Shadow, and placed a blanket across the dog's hind legs. "He's not afraid," the boy said softly. "He says he's done his part." April blinked, and something in her expression shifted. "He's lucky to have found you both." The day passed in a strange stillness. Sarah canceled her shift at the clinic. April left behind a small kit with medications and instructions, though she confessed later she wasn't sure Sarah would need them. Evan never left Shadow's side. He read aloud from his favorite book, an old illustrated collection of animal tales Thomas had given him years ago. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound of his voice. Occasionally he'd lift his head, looking at Evan as if committing every feature to memory. As night fell, snow continued to drift outside the window. The fire burned low, and a soft golden light filled the room. Sarah sat at the table, sorting through papers from work she didn't have the heart to focus on. She glanced at the living room again, and froze. Shadow had shifted his head, placing it gently on Evan's lap. Evan looked up at his mother. "He's ready." Sarah crossed the room and knelt beside them. Her hand trembled as she reached out, stroking the place just behind Shadow's ear where the fur was softest. His breathing had slowed. His chest rose, fell, and then stopped. There was no struggle, no sound, only peace. Evan sat very still. A single tear traced down his cheek, but his hands did not move. He cradled Shadow's head, whispering, "Good boy. You kept your promise." Sarah wrapped her arms around her son and the dog, burying her face in shadows for one last time. The grief came quietly, not like a storm but like rain, steady, cleansing, real. The next morning, beneath a sky of pale blue and clouds shaped like feathers, they buried Shadow beneath the great oak tree in their backyard. The ground was cold, but not frozen. Sheriff Cole had come by earlier that day with a small wooden box, and helped dig the grave without needing to be asked. He didn't say much, just stood beside the hole with his hat in hand, eyes lowered. Sarah placed the folded flag that Thomas had once kept in his cabin beside Shadow's body. Evan stepped forward last, holding two items clutched tightly in his hands: a framed photograph of Thomas Reed in uniform, and Shadow's worn leather collar, now cleaned and polished. He laid them down gently. "He found us, just like you said he would," Evan whispered. They stood in silence as Sarah filled the grave. A simple wooden marker stood at its head, etched by hand with 3 words Evan had chosen himself: faithful, brave, home. That evening, Evan drew again. Not a house this time, but a forest, tall trees, soft trails, and in the center, a dog standing between 2 shadows, one of a man with a cane, the other a boy with a heart wide open. Shadow was gone, but he was not lost. 1 month had passed since the snow-covered earth in their backyard received the resting body of Shadow. Though the days had lengthened and the first hints of spring stirred in the wind, the absence inside the Mitchell home remained, not heavy or haunting but quiet, like a seat always left open at the dinner table, or a shadow that lingered in the corner of the room just a moment longer than expected. Sarah, now more at peace in her scrubs and her morning routines at the Blue Ridge Animal Clinic, still found herself glancing toward the oak tree from the kitchen window. Some days, she caught herself setting down 2 bowls of kibble. Other days, it was Evan's whispered conversations into the fireplace that made her heart ache with something like longing or belief. On one of those mornings, Evan had simply said, "It's time." Sarah paused while stirring her coffee. "Time for what, sweetheart?" "To meet him," Evan replied, tying his sneakers with focus that belied his age. "The next one. He's waiting." Sarah had learned not to question these declarations. Something in her son, whether it was the spark of intuition, the quiet guidance of dreams, or simply a soul tuned to frequencies beyond her reach, had been right before. And so, after breakfast, they climbed into her weather-worn Subaru and drove east, toward a small shelter nestled just outside Asheville's city limits. The facility was a modest, no-kill rescue center run by a couple named Darla and Hank. Darla, a petite woman with graying red curls and a steady voice, greeted them warmly at the entrance. She wore a faded denim jacket covered in dog hair, her pockets full of treats. Hank, a tall man with soft eyes and a limp that told stories he never offered, nodded politely from behind the front desk. "We've got some new arrivals," Darla said as she led them through the narrow hallway lined with kennels. "Few shepherd mixes came in last week, one especially timid. Bit of a mystery, that one. Came with no tags, no microchip. Just a name scrawled on the intake form. Jack." Evan walked quietly beside her, his hand clutching the edge of Sarah's coat. As they passed each kennel, dogs barked or whimpered or wagged. Some pawed at the bars. But one kennel near the back was silent. Inside sat a small German shepherd pup, no more than 5 months old, his coat a pale sable with a soft black mask just beginning to darken with age. His ears were too large for his head, one flopping slightly. He didn't approach the bars or bark. Instead, he watched them, wide amber eyes full of questions, not fear. "That's Jack," Darla said gently. "Or so the form says. Been quiet since he arrived. Eats, drinks, but won't come when called. Hasn't warmed up to anyone yet." But Evan was already kneeling. He didn't speak at first. Just pressed his palm flat against the wire mesh. The puppy tilted his head, then stood slowly and padded forward, nose touching Evan's fingers. Sarah felt her breath catch. "He's not Jack," Evan whispered. "His name is Light." Darla blinked. "That's so?" Evan nodded, then turned to Sarah, his voice certain. "Shadow told me. He's been teaching him. In dreams." Sarah knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on Evan's shoulder. She looked into the pup's eyes and saw something familiar. Not a reflection of Shadow, but something new, quieter, gentler. Not a protector forged in fire, but one just beginning to learn the shape of loyalty. She smiled. "Light, huh? That's a big name for such a small guy." Evan beamed. "But he'll grow into it." They brought him home that afternoon. At first, Light was cautious, lingering at doorways and retreating beneath tables. He trembled at loud noises and flinched at sudden movement. But Evan was patient. He left toys nearby, sat quietly with books beside the crate, and whispered to Light each night before bed. He's showing him how, Evan told Sarah one evening. Shadows teaching him from the stars. Sarah didn't dismiss it. Not anymore. Not after everything. The backyard, once the domain of a vigilant guardian, now became a classroom for a timid student. Light sniffed curiously at the base of the oak tree where Shadow rested, pawed softly at the dirt, then looked up, as if listening. On a breezy Sunday afternoon, Sarah stood at the window watching Evan toss a tennis ball across the yard. Light ran after it with awkward, joyful bounds. He didn't always return it, but he always looked back to see Evan smiling. Above them, the branches of the oak swayed in the wind. The sun filtered through in dappled light, painting the ground in golden shapes. Sarah pressed her hand to the glass and closed her eyes. For a moment, she felt it. Not just memory, not grief, but presence. The whisper of pause that would never tread that path again. The echo of loyalty that never truly leaves. The promise honored. Sometimes, God sends his angels not with wings, but with fur for paws and eyes that see through the brokenness into our hearts. Shadow came into Evan's life not by chance, but by divine purpose, to protect, to teach, and to love without condition. And even in his passing, his mission did not end. He left behind Light, not just a new companion, but a message. That love continues, that purpose transcends pain, and that heaven often whispers through the ones we least expect. In our daily lives, we may not always understand why certain souls cross our path, whether they stay for a season or a lifetime, but their presence is never random. If you're facing loss, loneliness, or doubt, remember, God sees you. He sends comfort in forms we sometimes overlook. It could be in a child's quiet wisdom, a stranger's kindness, or even a stray dog showing up at your door on a stormy night. Let this story remind us all to keep our hearts open, to healing, to hope, and to the silent miracles walking beside us. If this story touched your heart, type Amen in the comments to honor Shadow and all the loyal companions who've guided us with love. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may you always recognize his quiet miracles in your life.